When charged with figuring out how to protect 10 miles of New York City neighborhoods from flooding, Bjarke Ingels decided to conceive the barrier primarily as a recreation area and waterfront park. The Dryline was born, and the visionary Danish architect who conceived the idea has become a global celebrity. Ingels planned to build new walkways, bike paths, and green space, and protect it with earthen berms, retractable walls, and hardy plants, not unlike our moss on stage, which can absorb seawater and as elegantly simple as it is ingenious. Ingels calls the Dryline, which won the federally funded post-Hurricane Sandy Rebuild by Design contest, a love child of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. He'll join us via Skype, which he is with us here now. But before we get into our conversation, we have a short, very cool video to show you Ingels' vision. So can we cue the video, please?
That was actually why Sandy was so bad, is because of the phase of the moon. It was already a very large high tide, as well as the storm surge coming in with the wind and the tide lining up perfectly to give us 14-foot tides instead of 8-foot.
I'd like to see some type of flood protection in this area. That's going to happen. We're vulnerable, obviously, being this close to the water.
Something that just brings like more walks, different walks of life, you know, another escape from just the busyness and the hustle and bustle.
There's this great space that could really become community space, cultural space, and active uses.
Everyone enjoys space. And in New York and other congested cities, it's hard to come by.
Anything that makes the cities greener is just such a wonderful thing for not only the environment, but the people that live in the city too, to be able to be around that space.
The plans, the berming, the sense of how it can become into the natural landscape itself, how we want to program that is really the next challenge. We are the link, we're the tip in the sense of the big U. It's important that the entire waterfront of Lower Manhattan build in the plans that have been put forward, because we can not only fortify this great city of New York, but be a model for cities all over the world.
Wow. Bjarke, thank you so much for joining us. And for that video, super cool. I can see Jim Anderson in the front row saying, we need a video like that for CityLab. Thank you for joining us. Let me just start off and ask you, the title of this session is really, Can the Dryline Save New York? And here you've got basically 10 major blocks that you've buffered and created a line. And I'm interested in, when you began to put this project together, how you began to think about what you were going to save, what the concept was, and how expansive it would be.
I mean, I think we've considered the Dryline, as we've sort of nicknamed it, as what you could call a piece of social infrastructure, and it's literally a term from the 70s that normally refers to the amount of kindergartens and healthcare centers that a city has, but we actually mean it much more literally. That we all know that a piece of infrastructure like a highway or a bridge can have a negative impact on the environment. The way that a highway can separate one neighborhood from another, or the way that a bridge puts a sort of casts a shadow on the space underneath. But we thought, what if what if we can actually devise of a piece of infrastructure like the infrastructure for resiliency in a way that it actually comes with positive, premeditated social and environmental side effects. So we thought, and we looked at the High Line here in New York, which is essentially a piece of decommissioned infrastructure. It's former rail yard tracks that have now become the second most frequented park in New York. And we thought, like, what if we don't have to wait until the train tracks shut down? Or what if we don't have to wait until the flood wall is no longer a flood wall? What if we can design the flood protection for Manhattan in such a way that it actually comes with all these positive social side effects? And you mentioned Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, and we actually mean it quite literally, because if you look at Robert Moses, he actually created a lot of the very important public projects of New York, including the highways, the parks, and a lot of the public housing, but always with a very top-down approach. So it often had like a devastating impact on the local environment. And at some point he tried to run the Trans-Manhattan Highway through Greenwich Village. And he encountered resistance from Jane Jacobs, who in a sort of a David Goliath moment rallied the local community and defeated the plans and saved the village. So we thought for this project of this magnitude to protect Manhattan from flooding, it really needs to become a love child of the two. Because to resist an incoming flood, you need 10 miles of contiguous sort of hard engineering. But to make it socially successful, it needs to happen rooted in a close dialogue with the local community.
I'm showing the audience a picture now of one of the walls, the big red wall, that is anticipating one of these big floods. And I guess part of the question I have is, what scale of flooding does your system anticipate? I know I've read in Denmark you plan every 500 years. We in American infrastructure often look at, and particularly New York, every 100 years. But one of the friendly criticisms of this beautiful project is that this might deal with a Hurricane Sandy, but as we have more climate change effects, that this might not be something that does the trick.
I mean, we are planning towards what you call a 100-year event. So in that sense, and you know, of course, we're leaning up against like the best scientific advice that we can get. But of course, it's a political decision. How far into the future do you want to plan? But also like since you are on the image of the orange wall, so people don't fear that we want to build a giant orange wall in front of the east side of Manhattan. What this image is showing is actually, it's the after image of a before and after image series, where we're actually suggesting that you can simply mount artworks, if you like, or like murals underneath the FDR, the elevated highway. And in the case of a flood, and that's what you're seeing here, those panels can actually come down and the backside becomes the flood protection, so that on the everyday, all we're doing is actually making the underside of the FDR a little more beautiful, but then that underside can actually flip down and protect the city from flooding. So it also there's like some elasticity and some flexibility in the approach.
I'm going to move to a different slide here. Some have described your work here, Bjarke, as climate security as leisure amenity. And I'm sort of interested in whether or not this design that you brought, I find so intriguing, whether it nonetheless lulls a community not to take things like climate change and really the very drastic, hard choices that lie ahead as seriously as they might would. What is your response to that critique?
I mean, I think, of course, you have to do both. Of course, like making flood protection doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about our environment. It just means that we somehow today have to live with the consequences of our lifestyle of the last 50 to 100 years. However, the thinking is that I've always been very skeptic of environmentalism that is based on sort of inspiring fear. And because I think it's kind of it's a losing proposition. It's and we came up with the term we call hedonistic sustainability. That sustainability doesn't have to be about, you know, cold showers. It doesn't have to be about how much of our current quality of life are we willing to sacrifice in order to afford being sustainable. But rather, what if a sustainable city is more enjoyable than a non-sustainable one? And one of our first projects in Copenhagen was actually the Copenhagen Harbor Bath. And that's basically because Copenhagen Harbor has become so clean, the water has become so clean that you can swim in it. And that means that a clean harbor is not just good for the fish, it's actually incredible for the citizens living in that city, that they don't have to sit for hours to get to the Hamptons. They can actually jump in the port in the middle of the city. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of examples where an environmentally progressive city or a resilient city can actually also be a more enjoyable city. And in that sense, we were thinking if we're building this whole flood protection for many millions or even billions of dollars, and we're only gonna, it's only gonna be like enjoyed that one moment when the next Sandy arrives, what if we can use those or leverage those dollars to actually also enhance the connection from the city to the water and make the waterfront more amenable and enjoyable? So it's more like a question of like reaching or hitting as many targets with a single element.
Bjarke, I wasn't going to ask you about cost, but since you raised the issue of dollars, I'm sitting here, we're looking at a really gorgeous reverse aquarium that the Guardian newspaper described as a symbol of your implacable optimism. I love this idea, but what is all of this going to cost? And who's going to pay for it?
So right now we are working on the East River portion, which is the first couple of miles along the East River Park. And that has been funded with a combination of federal and city funds. And then right now we're starting to take a look at, you could say, like the bottom of the U, which is basically from two bridges, basically by Manhattan Bridge, all the way down to the south tip of Battery Park, and then including Battery Park City. And there the funding, there is some public funding, but there the idea is also to leverage the fact that you actually have a lot of wealth and a lot of prosperous businesses on the south tip, to try to see if we can make some of the funding in a more public and private partnership. But the whole East River portion is already funded.
Real quickly, I was at Battery Park the other day and I saw quite a bit of construction going on down there. Are they already working with you in your designs? Have these already begun to be built in to a larger concept?
Not yet. I know that the Battery Park is already making some upgrades. Also, like since you saw Warry Parker in the video talking about how she lost everything. So they have actually sort of already begun some reinforcements on their own. But the idea is that once we get there, to actually reimagine the topography of the Battery Park to make the Battery Park itself a major part of the fortification of Lower Manhattan. It's also where you will get the biggest waves, because like you'll have the water coming in through the mouth of the Hudson. So that also means that this, even though it's going to be like miles of contiguous waterfront protection, the strategies depend very much on the type of threat that we are designing against, and also the type of landscape or urban condition that we're dealing with.
I'm very conscious that we're sitting on the edge of the world here in Miami, and Miami is struggling and thinking a lot about some of these issues. We have mayors from all over the world here who are thinking through many of their own resilience questions. And I'm interested in what insights you have from doing this project, from interacting with the community, trying to put a design forward that would be useful outside of New York, applied in other situations, either from climate or other challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important, and I think that's where the Dryline has succeeded so far, at least in its inception, is that rather than simply coming with all of the hard engineering, and basically dropping a big piece of flood protection infrastructure, flood wall on the waterfront, we actually targeted and engaged directly with representatives of the different community groups, the different NGOs, different sort of housing projects on the east side, to engage in a dialogue, to actually ask them about their experiences during Sandy, and also what would be their wish list, like basically in the thinking, if we're gonna move some earth around, if we're gonna plant some new trees, if we're gonna like fortify your waterfront, what other sort of wishes should we fulfill while doing so? Like, now that we have the toolbox open, are there any other things we can do? And in that sense, I think we've been met with an accommodation because the local community could see that we were not just trying to fortify the waterfront, we were also trying to make their neighborhood a more enjoyable one. And I think in that sense, I think all of the sort of upcoming necessary investments in resiliency that all the mayors that you're sitting with are going to be facing is, of course, a major challenge, but I think also an amazing opportunity to fix some of the things that are normally quite hard to mobilize the community around, and that are normally hard to raise the necessary funding for. So in that sense, this idea of social infrastructure, that you combine hard utility and necessity with sort of enjoyment and amenity at the same time.
Just as we close, Bjarke, I was on your Twitter feed this morning. I'm now following you, and you had your colleague at the Bjarke Ingels group that put up a teaser video of the Hyperloop and what you're working on with the Hyperloop. And I'm interested in what else is in your head that you haven't shared with us yet. What's the next big infrastructure thing that might be relevant to cities, and how we're thinking about the future that you want to release to the world right now at this moment?
I think one thing that I'd like to share is that, and in the notion of social infrastructure, is one of the things that we are looking at that has incredible impact potential. And I would say the Hyperloop is part of this, but it's that new technology becomes more and more eco-friendly to the point where we have to completely change our paradigm. And right now we are finishing a building in Copenhagen that is a waste-to-energy power plant that is so clean that there are no toxins coming out of the chimney, only a little bit of CO2 and a little bit of steam. So we've been able to design the entire roof of this power plant as an alpine ski slope, because in Copenhagen we actually have snow, but we don't have any mountains. We have to go to Sweden to ski. But because this power plant, and normally you would want to be as far away from a power plant as possible, but in this case it's so clean that the roof becomes a public park. It's going to have a ski slope, and it's going to have the tallest climbing wall in the world, 300 feet. And finally, to sort of really hammer the point home about trying to change people's minds about how environmentally progressive technology can really change the way we look at our cities, we've designed the chimney so that it accumulates steam, and then at regular intervals it puffs a gigantic smoke ring or a steam ring as a celebration. So rather than being a chimney being like a traditional symbol of all our failures, you know, all the pollution that we let out, this chimney is going to be a celebration of our successes. It's going to be every time we've reduced the carbon emissions in Copenhagen with 1 ton of CO2, we celebrate it by puffing a gigantic ring of steam. So
you know, I didn't have any idea how he would respond to this question, whether he had any good ideas or not. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bjarke Ingels, designer and architect at Dryline. Thank you so much, Bjarke.